afternoon. I'm Jana Martin, Chief Executive Officer of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We're delighted that you're able to spend the next 1.5 hours with us virtually today for part 12 of our We Hold These Truths series titled Child and Adolescent Gender Affirmative Care in Motion, What We Know and What We're Learning. Presenting today's webinar are Drs. Stephen Rosenthal and Diane Ehrensaft, who are inspiring leaders and innovators in the field of gender nonconforming youth, transgender health, gender variance, and dysphoria. Most importantly, they have imagined and created support for families and for youth in their quest for a true gender self. They are both widely published, share their knowledge in all forms of media, and in presentations such as this one today. Also, they are tireless advocates. Dr. Rosenthal is a professor of pediatrics at the University of California, San Francisco, where he has served as the program director for pediatric endocrinology and director of the pediatric endocrine clinics. He currently serves as co-founder and medical director of the multidisciplinary UCSF Child and Adolescent Gender Center. He is a principal investigator for NICHD's The Impact of Early Medical Treatment in Transgender Youth and co-investigator on 2 additional NIH-funded studies focused on optimizing care of transgender, gender-diverse youth. He also provides care for children with endocrine disorders such as abnormalities of growth, puberty, and thyroid functioning. Dr. Ehrensaft is a developmental and clinical psychologist and adjunct professor of pediatrics at the University of California, San Francisco, and director of mental health at the Child and Adolescent Gender Care Center, UCSF Benioff Child's Hospital. She is the author of The Gender Creative Child and Gender Born, Gender Made, and is co-editor with Dr. Colt Keogh-Meyer of the Gender Affirmative Model. She specializes in research, writing, clinical work, training, and consultation related to gender-expansive children, and publishes and lectures both nationally and internationally on this topic. We had the pleasure of having Drs. Rosenthal and Ehrensaft present a session at this year's National Practice Conference last month, and attendees praised their presentation, saying it was compelling, informative, useful, and fabulous. I can tell you that in addition to their being incredibly gifted researchers and clinicians, they are truly caring professionals. They are both passionate, caring, fun, selfless, creative human beings. They engage in their work because it is meaningful to them. Their courage is unflagging. They educate others about inclusion and acceptance by the way they live their lives. I hope everyone learns a lot over the next 1.5 hours. I want to say a special thank you to my colleagues and friends, Diane and Steve. Thank you so much again for being with us today. Dr. Rosenthal, I believe your turn.
Well, thank you so much, Jana. It really is an honor and a privilege for me to participate in this webinar series and to present alongside my very close colleague and friend, Dr. Ehrensaft, and also really an opportunity to provide a medical perspective on adolescent gender care. So thank you again. Let's see, please enhance. There we go. So these are my disclosures. Jana did mention the grant funding that I, as well as Dr. Ehrensaft, have. I have no other financial disclosures, and all medications that I will be mentioning in the course of this presentation are considered off-label specifically for gender dysphoric youth. So I'd like to begin with basically a description of what we could consider to be the underlying principles of gender affirming care. The first point is that being transgender or gender diverse is no longer considered pathological, but instead it represents an example of human diversity. And second, every individual is entitled to live in the gender that is most authentic to them. From the perspective of the medical professional, it is basically our role to assist eligible transgender and gender diverse individuals, preferably in an interdisciplinary model of care, to achieve their gender embodiment goals as effectively and safely as possible. So what I'd like to cover in my portion is to just do a quick overview of some key definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about something that I think is quite compelling, which is evidence that there are actually biological underpinnings to gender identity development. Then I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the epidemiology and the mental health concerns, which really explain why we do this work. And then look at the outcomes of current treatment models, and then finally basically land on gaps in knowledge, barriers to care, and where we need to go in terms of our research. So just to start with some basic definitions, biological sex, of course, is defined as the physical or genetic attributes that characterize biologic maleness or femaleness. And examples of this, of course, would include the genitalia, the gonads, and sex chromosomes. In contrast, gender identity is somebody's fundamental inner sense of self as male or female, and is not always binary. And it is not something that you can see. So you can't do a physical examination and know what a person's gender identity is. And I think this particular cartoon that was in fact lent to me by Dr. Ahrenshaft really makes this point very well. You see one adult approaching another adult that's pushing a baby carriage, and the first adult asks, "Is it a boy or girl?" Pardon me, and the other responds, "I don't know, it can't talk yet." So we're so used to categorizing people, or categorizing so many things in life, but people by looking between their legs when someone is born, in other words, as an indicator of their sex at birth. But in fact, as you see, this person responds, "I don't know, it can't talk yet." That really underscores the idea that the only way we know what somebody's gender identity is based on what that person tells us it is. Just a few other terms to define. So gender expression is a person's external manifestations of their gender, for example, hairstyle, choice of clothing. And it's important to note that this is not always aligned with a person's gender identity. It's also important to be aware of the fact that gender identity does not predict a person's sexual orientation. And in other words, a person with any gender identity can have any sexual orientation. Finally, when we talk about transgender, sometimes called gender incongruence, this is defined as a marked and persistent identification with a gender that is different from what is sometimes called the natal or assigned gender. And of course, that is referring to the gender that is assumed based on the physical sex characteristics present at birth. Now, you may have heard of the term cisgender, kind of drawing on what some of us may have learned in biochemistry, for those that took a biochemistry course in their training, where trans refers to things that are on opposite sides of something, and cis often refers biologically in molecules to things that are on the same side. So people have adopted that word in the gender world to refer to a situation where gender identity and the physical sex characteristics are in alignment or congruent. A very important change in terminology happened just about 10 years ago. This being led by the American Psychiatric Association, where at their meeting in San Francisco in 2013, they stopped the use of gender identity disorder and replaced it with gender dysphoria. And this really underscores that the whole idea of having a transgender identity itself is not longer to be considered a pathology. Just a few years ago, in 2019, the World Health Organization declassified gender incongruence as a mental disorder in their international classification of diseases. And the overall concern has been focused on gender dysphoria. If a person that's trans happens to have gender dysphoria, not all gender diverse people do, but gender dysphoria is defined as the significant emotional distress that may be associated with a transgender identity. So I mentioned that I did want to spend a few minutes on an area that I think is quite compelling, particularly when I hear politicians and other people with large megaphones say things like, "Oh, the so-called transgender ideology," as if gender diversity doesn't exist, and as if, yeah, this is just some fantasy. But there are some very compelling research studies that have emerged in the last 10 to 15 years that support the concept that gender identity likely reflects a complex interplay of biology, environment, and cultural factors. And this particular cartoon here, where I'm basically summarizing the subdomains for biological factors, meaning genetics, hormones, and neurobiology. This comes from a review that I recently wrote, and I have been assured that the PDF, which I will be making available for this and a couple of other articles I'll be referencing in my talk, will be made available to all attendees of this webinar on the Trust website. So what I want to do is, I mean, I could spend a whole hour talking just about the biology of gender, but I just want to go over a few quick highlights. And so first of all, evidence that the DNA, so from genetic studies, plays a role in gender identity development. This is quite an interesting study. It's from a while ago already, from 2012, but it comes out of Europe, and it basically is looking at twins. And in order to be a part of this study, at least one of the individuals in the twin pair has to meet the mental health criteria for having gender dysphoria. And in this particular study, which was a multi-center study in Europe, there were 23 pairs of identical twins. Then there were 21 pairs of same-sex but not identical twins. And then there were 7 opposite-sex twin pairs. And what they were looking for was, what was the concordance of gender dysphoria? Meaning, if one of the individuals in the twin pair had gender dysphoria, what was the likelihood that the other one also did? And if you look at those individuals that were identical twins, monozygotic twins, there was a 39% concordance. In contrast, if you shared the same parents but not the same DNA, there was a 0% concordance, and for the opposite sex twins, also 0%. So this certainly suggests that there's something in the DNA, but I imagine you're thinking, well, gee, if the DNA is so important, wouldn't you expect the concordance in the identical twins to be even higher than 39%? And I think that that's a very appropriate question. But we know that there are a number of limitations to think of in any study about prevalence of gender dysphoria, one of which is that we know that this can be limited by a person's degree of self-awareness at the time the questions are being asked. And number two, what is that person's willingness to disclose that information to the person who's asking the questions? We also know that there can be other factors that can influence which genes are expressed or not expressed. So you can share the exact same DNA, but there can be what are referred to as epigenetic changes in the DNA that might then result in differences among gene expression within 2 members of the same pair of twins. So following on that, a number of investigators have tried to figure out, well, hey, if we see these studies in identical twins, can we possibly identify the gene or genes that might be responsible for this observation? And so I'm just going to show you an example of one study that I think is quite compelling. And this is a study from the US and Australia, where they looked at almost 400 transgender females. When I say transgender females, these are individuals that are designated male at birth, but that identify as female. And there was an almost equivalent number of cisgender male controls. And what they were looking at was in specific, what we sometimes call candidate genes. And these are genes that are involved in sex hormone signaling in the body, looking for variations in those genes. These variations could include something called repeat length or single nucleotide polymorphisms. And what they were basically looking for was whether or not there were particular variations in the genes of those individuals that were transgender that occurred with a greater frequency compared to the cisgender controls. And what they found was that there was a significant association between gender dysphoria and a number of alleles being defined as particular variations in certain genes. And what they specifically found was that in the transgender individuals, there was an overrepresentation of several allele combinations that involve the androgen receptor. And so this supports the hypothesis that interactions among multiple genes, and in particular those involved in sex hormone signaling, may in fact contribute to variations in gender identity. What about the question here? Is there a neurobiologic basis for being transgender? So there have been any number of really interesting brain studies, but I want to show you one functional brain study and one structural brain study. And so here's the first question. So functional brain differences have been described in response to smell and visual stimuli. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that these differences were noted according to sex, both in adults and children. And then the question is like, well, what happens with gender? Basically, if you have somebody smell something or perhaps look at something, there are different regions in the brain actually that get activated according to whether you're of the male sex or female sex. I mean, who knew? It's fascinating stuff. So then the question comes up with, well, do these differences always align primarily with the person's sex, or could they align with the person's gender? So here's quite an interesting study that was published a few years ago from the Netherlands. And what they did was something called a functional MRI, where you can look at brain activation. And this was done during what they call a mental rotation task. So what is a mental rotation task? In this situation, individuals were presented with two differentially rotated three-dimensional figures right in front of them. And they were being asked whether these figures are identical or mirror images. And it turns out that there is a sex difference in the way a person responds to this that's been noted in both adults and children. And by a sex difference, I mean that there are common areas of the brain that are involved regardless of the sex, but there are particular regions that one will see in one sex but not in the other when doing this task. And so they did a study in adolescents. These were individuals who were designated female at birth but identified as male. So we would call them transgender male adolescents. And they had an average age of 16. So again, a male gender identity. And very importantly, these people were not yet treated with testosterone. And then there was an equivalent number of controls, both of the male and female sex, that were age matched. And what did they find? So these are composite data looking at the left hemisphere and the right hemispheres of the brain. And these sort of orange, red, yellow colors are indicating which parts of the brain are lighting up or being active during the mental rotation task. And so we have control boys. Just focus on the left side of this diagram. You'll see control boys on the top, control girls on the bottom, and then what the investigators refer to as girls with gender dysphoria. We would refer to these individuals as transgender male adolescents because they are of the female sex but identify as males. What you can see is that in the control girls, there's an area here in the left parietal area that lights up but does not light up in the control boys. And if you look at those individuals who are of the female sex but identify as boys, they have exactly the same pattern as the control boys and very different from the control girls. Here's a study published just a couple of years ago, quite a large study, basically looking at structural brain measures by MRI in a significant number of participants, both transgender males, transgender females, and controls. And again, these brain structural studies were carried out before any treatment with either testosterone or estrogen. And the results were quite compelling. They found that transgender persons differed significantly from cisgender controls with respect to a number of different aspects in the brain structure, such as what they describe as subcortical brain volume, surface area, not cortical thickness. And their summary is quite interesting, so I just put it in quotes. They basically state that transgender persons have a, quote, unique brain phenotype, unquote, and then, quote, rather than being merely shifted towards either end of the male to female spectrum. So my summary for this portion of the presentation is basically to hopefully share with you successfully that there is increasing evidence supporting a role of biology and gender identity. And the goal in reviewing such studies is not to develop a litmus test to confirm somebody's gender identity, and certainly not to uncover a mechanism that can be fixed to prevent diversity of the gender. Rather, my hope is that knowledge of these types of studies can destigmatize and lead to increased acceptance, improved quality of life, and decreased health disparities for individuals with diverse gender identities. So how common is transgender? Just one of several slides I could show you. But this is one that I think is extremely well done from the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law that is looking at the percent of individuals who identify as transgender by age in the United States. You see the age groups on the left and then the percents here on the right. And basically, this was the result of state level and population-based and CDC surveys that were carried out. If we focus on adolescents, which is the focus of our presentations today, you can see a prevalence of about 0.7%, which represents about 1 in 140 individuals. So this clearly is not a rare situation. One of the things that's been quite fascinating, and this is, I just like the compelling message from this diagram, but what you see here is the referral rate, the annual referrals here on the vertical axis, and then an 8-year period over here on the horizontal axis from 2009, 2010, and then through 8 years later. And you can see over this 8-year period, there's a dramatic 20-fold increase in referrals to this particular clinic in the UK. This is very representative of what we have been seeing in the United States and really all around the world. And of course, I can't help but wonder what is responsible for the exponential increase in referrals in recent years. So another very compelling study from the Netherlands basically indicates that this likely reflects less stigma in seeking help for gender dysphoria, and their findings were not consistent with individuals being treated, or rather being referred with lesser degrees of gender dysphoria. Another quite interesting thing epidemiologically is there has been, in about the last 15 years, an inversion in the sex ratio of people that are presenting for care. There used to be a predominance of individuals who are designated male at birth and identified as female, and now there's the inverse of that, where we're seeing a majority of individuals who are designated female at birth but present as male. So these are results from a large international survey from the Pediatric Endocrine Society in North America and the European Society of Pediatric Endocrinology. Also one center in Chile in South America, representing over 2,800 youth that presented to a gender clinic. And in this composite group, they found that designated females at birth, identifying as male, represented 63% of the individuals. So why do we do this work? We really do this work because of the mental health concerns, the challenges that transgender individuals have. And the data that I'm going to show you in the next slide and in a couple of other slides later on come from a grant that Dr. Aaron Saft and I are investigators in. It's a Foresight NIH-funded study that Jana mentioned at the very beginning. And we're very excited that we're able to do this work and publish the results, the 4 sites being our site at UCSF, then Harvard, University of Southern California, and Lurie Children's at Northwestern. So this is a study of looking at the baseline mental health in this 4-site study. And basically, we looked at 2 cohorts of individuals, those individuals who were in the earliest stages of puberty, who are candidates for using puberty blockers, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides. This represented about 95 individuals at an average age of 11, and then a larger cohort of individuals who were later in puberty that were about to initiate care with testosterone or estrogen. And I want you to focus on the bottom part of this slide, where we're looking at the prevalence of internalizing disorders here, such as depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and suicide attempts. And you can see the percentages in this younger cohort versus the older cohort. And there are remarkable numbers in both, but you can see in every pairing that there are greater numbers here, so a much greater likelihood of having these internalizing disorders in the older group. And so one of the conclusions of this study is highlighting the possible benefits of accessing gender-affirming treatment earlier in life. So what is the natural history of transgender gender dysphoria in children and adolescents? And this slide, I think, is one of the most important because this really represents the rationale for medical interventions in early puberty. And what has been observed in longitudinal studies, primarily in the Netherlands, is that gender dysphoria that has emerged before puberty and persists into early puberty, or gender dysphoria that emerges for the first time at puberty, is highly predictive of that person being transgender as an adult. And so the pioneering work for gender-affirming medical care was done in Amsterdam, initiated about 30 years ago. And they began to use what we call puberty blockers, which are medications also called GnRH agonists over here, that have been the gold standard treatment for over 4 decades for a completely different condition called precocious puberty. And again, they suggested that if you have somebody who has significant gender dysphoria at the time that physical puberty has begun, that it's very likely that this person will persist in identifying as transgender. Why not give them an opportunity not to have to go through the wrong puberty? And so basically the idea, these are the puberty blockers. I'll just spend a second here. As an endocrinologist, I feel compelled to show you at least one slide showing like endocrine pathways. But basically, there is a particular hormone that is made in the hypothalamus called GnRH, which stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone. This goes into the circulation between the hypothalamus and pituitary. The pituitary, when it sees this signal, then puts out its own hormones, LH and FSH, which in turn stimulate the gonads, meaning obviously the ovary or the testes, to make their hormones and their germ cells for fertility. A puberty blocker or a GnRH agonist is a super strong form of this naturally occurring hormone here. In fact, it's so strong that it basically turns off the pituitary's ability to see the body's own production of the related hormone. As a result, this whole function of the pituitary shuts down, and this then leads to basically a marked reduction, if not virtually a complete reduction, in secretion of estrogen or testosterone, and really an arresting of the maturation process of eggs and sperm. I should note, though, that when you remove this medication, it's completely reversible. So the expected benefits are that these blockers buy time. They prevent experiencing the puberty of the undesired sex. Again, they're thought to be fully reversible. And of course, once physical puberty is completed, it can be very difficult to blend into society according to your affirmed gender. For example, if you are designated male but identify as female, and you've gone through full male puberty, you could end up with a very low voice, Adam's apple, masculine facial features, et cetera. And conversely, someone designated female at birth going through full female puberty will obviously have typical breast development. So current models of care are summarized here on the Endocrine Society's clinical practice guideline. And then the next I'll show you from an organization called the World Professional Association of Transgender Health Standards of Care. I've made both of these available to you as well. Both of the PDFs here will also be available to you on the Trust website. But basically this summarizes, I think this is a very important slide as well, but this basically summarizes the pediatric and adolescent recommendations. And I want to highlight the one line that is right there in white, which is that the determination of whether or not a person has gender dysphoria should be made by a qualified mental health professional. And that is why we so value our professional connections with our mental health providers from the perspective of a medical person, and really highlights the interdisciplinary nature of this work. If and when a determination is made by a qualified mental health professional that a person would benefit from use of puberty blockers, then we would consider using puberty blockers, but again, only after puberty has been reached. And then in an older individual, perhaps somewhere between 14 and 16, if they have demonstrated sufficient mental capacity to give informed consent, and still feel that they are on the path where transition is appropriate, then we may likely initiate gender-affirming sex hormone care. When it comes to surgeries, for the most part, gender-affirming genital surgeries are deferred at least until the age of 18 or the age of legal majority, though breast reduction can be considered to be done earlier, though this is very much determined on a case-by-case basis. So this is in reference to the other document that can be made available to you, which is the Standards of Care, version 8 from WPATH. And basically, to summarize, the recommendations for the pediatric adolescent care are very much consistent with the ones that I just showed you from the Endocrine Society guideline. So, well, what is the impact of following these guidelines? So this is a paper that was published a number of years ago, but I think it is very compelling. It was one of the first to look at medium-term follow-up. So 6 years follow-up from the pioneering group in the Netherlands. They had a relatively small group of 55 adolescent transgender individuals. They were treated with blockers, followed by gender-affirming sex hormones, and then at the average age of almost 21, had undergone gender reassignment surgery. This is a study that looked exclusively at mental health outcomes. And they looked at these outcomes just before starting blockers, in between the time of starting blockers and just before starting sex hormones, and then a year after surgery. And here are their findings. What they found was at the end of these 3 stages of care, gender dysphoria, using the mental health instruments that they employed, the Utrecht Gender Dysphoria Scale, that gender dysphoria was fully resolved and that psychological functioning was generally improved. But here's something that always impressed me, and I think really helped inspire me and motivated me to feel that what I was doing as a medical provider was the right thing to do. What they found was that the sense of well-being of these transgender adolescents was equivalent and in some cases even superior to age-matched controls from the general Dutch population. And interestingly, no patients in the study reported regret at any phase of the protocol. Here's another important study that was published a few years ago from Jack Turbin and colleagues that basically was based on a cross-sectional survey in transgender adults, over 20,000 of them that were between 18 and 36 years of age. And what was looked at in this study was the self-reported history of pubertal suppression with a puberty blocker during adolescence. And what they found was that there was a significantly lower odds of lifetime suicidal ideation if these individuals had been treated with a puberty blocker in comparison to those who wanted this treatment but did not receive it. Now, this is a paper I'm very excited to share with you. Diane and I are co-authors on this paper. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine earlier this year. And this is the first mental health outcome paper looking at the first 2 years following gender-affirming sex hormones in the study that I was telling you about. In this study, we have over 315 individuals at an average age of 16. Here also, we had a predominance of designated females at birth, almost 65%. And what was done is a statistical analysis that frankly, I wasn't familiar with before this particular study, but basically this is using unconditional latent growth models. You may be more familiar with this than I am because these statistical approaches are much more commonly used in the mental health and other of the social sciences. But this particular statistical approach takes into account only the effect of time. And you looked at 2 things here, what's called an intercept mean. In other words, it basically is where people are starting at baseline. And then most importantly, the slope mean, which represents the change over time. And the question that was being asked in this study was, do the slopes, the trajectories of outcomes, change significantly in the expected directions? And what we found was that depression and anxiety decreased significantly. And in contrast, appearance congruence, and that is defined as the degree to which physical characteristics begin to be aligned or do in fact align with a person's inner gender identity, as well as positive affect and life satisfaction, we found all increased significantly. And this is basically the data. So basically, I want you to focus on the slope mean, and I want you to look at the fact that we have 5 things here. So again, appearance congruence, depression, anxiety, and then positive affect and life satisfaction. And if you look at this slope mean going across from left to right, you'll see that all of the boxes are either outlined in green or in red. Those that are outlined in green show a significantly positive change. Those outlined in red show a significantly negative change. And this basically shows the data, and you can see this in greater detail. I'm also going to present this article for your consideration on the Trust website, basically showing a positive change in appearance congruence, positive affect and life satisfaction, and a decrease in depression and anxiety. Of course, there are not only hoped for benefits, but possible adverse effects. In this case, bone, brain, fertility, and otherwise. I'm going to go through this part relatively quickly, but one of the considerations that we focus on is bone, because we know that peak bone mass is achieved during puberty and young adulthood and is a major determinant of future adult risk fracture. So when you intervene with a puberty blocker, particularly if you're using it for a longer period than I think one should, there could be the risk of decreased bone mineral density and a future risk of fractures. Fortunately, current longitudinal studies have demonstrated an expected fall in the bone mineral density Z-scores. And I want to spend just 1 second to make sure that we're all clear on this. When a bone mineral density Z-score is being discussed, that is not the absolute content of bone. That is the relative amount of bone compared to somebody that you're comparing it to. When you put somebody on a puberty blocker, you're slowing down the rate of calcium deposition into bone, but you're not causing a loss of calcium into bone. Okay, and so what has been shown is that when you put individuals on a puberty blocker, they don't lose bone, they just don't acquire it at the same rate as somebody who's not on a puberty blocker. However, following completion of the puberty blocker and treatment with testosterone after 3 years, this fully reverses. This has been shown in a couple of studies now, and similar findings appear to be happening now with estrogen, though further studies, particularly with estrogen, are needed and are underway, in particular in our Foresight study. What about the brain? So there is precious little that has been published about whether or not there's an adverse impact of puberty blockers on brain function. So I just want to summarize a couple of studies here. One is, it's just a case report, but I think it's worth discussing. It is known that during puberty, particularly what I'm describing now is what has been described to happen in those individuals designated male at birth, that there is variation in white matter microstructure. And what was found in one individual who had a brain MRI before then about 2 years after being on a blocker was in that person, they observed a lack of expected variation in white matter microstructure, and in addition, a mild decrease in operational memory. They did not report, to the best of my knowledge, a follow-up, like what happened if this person stopped a blocker or stopped the blocker and went on to transition. So I can tell you that this particular type of study is now being done in a Foresight study in the United States, also being funded by the NIH. I have the opportunity of serving as a consultant on that study, and we're hoping to have data to report soon. There was another study that was published a number of years ago, which looked at the acquisition of executive functioning, which of course is a developmental milestone typically achieved during puberty. And this particular study demonstrated no obvious adverse effects of puberty blockers on this milestone. What about fertility? We know that if you're treating somebody with a puberty blocker in early puberty, and the person subsequently transitions with gender-affirming sex hormones, this will often compromise their fertility and often represents a dilemma for parents who are deciding, hey, should I treat this kid, my kid, or wait till they're at a farther stage of puberty? And then, of course, if you're waiting till the person has achieved a farther stage of puberty, then there's a likelihood of increased gender dysphoria as a person's puberty progresses. But there's been something very exciting that I want to share with you, and that is the first ever report of in vivo egg maturation in a person who is on a puberty blocker. So this is a situation of a transgender male, in other words, somebody designated female at birth, that was put on a puberty blocker that achieved adequate pubertal suppression in early puberty. We describe that as Tanner-2. That's based on the name of a well-known pediatric endocrinologist from the UK whose name is attached to the different stages of puberty. So Tanner stage 2 actually represents the earliest physical stages of puberty. Tanner 1 means you're not yet in puberty, interestingly. This person had been treated for 2 years with a puberty blocker with demonstrated adequate pubertal suppression. But this family and this individual, they were keen on fertility preservation with their own genetic material. And so the providers went in and they continued them on the puberty blocker, but concurrently hyperstimulated them with these hormones. Happy to tell you more about that. and in the Q&A. And what they were able to do was this led to actually the development of mature eggs that they were able to retrieve and freeze. Now, of course, these kids are quite young and no one has tested yet the quality of these eggs, but this is really the first ever demonstration that you don't have to give up fertility, or you likely don't have to give up fertility preservation if you are on a puberty blocker, if you have ovaries. Just in a nutshell, and this is also summarized in the review article that will be made available to you, that in general, when it comes to gender-affirming sex hormones, and I'm highlighting this in green, in general, no clinically significant adverse effects with gender-affirming sex hormones have been observed in adolescents, but really in shorter-term studies. But I would be remiss if I didn't share with you this study. This was published a few years ago. It's a large cohort study from Europe with over 2,500 trans women, over 1,350 trans men, looking at the risks of acute cardiovascular events. And what they found was that for the transgender women, these are adults now, that they had a higher adjusted incidence of stroke versus reference women and men, and higher incidence of myocardial infarction versus reference women. And the trans men had a higher risk of MI versus the reference women. There are some significant limitations. There were no adjustments for psychosocial stressors or smoking, and a number of the people that were treated with estrogens were using a synthetic form instead of the naturally occurring form. And we know that the synthetic form carries a much greater risk for these cardiovascular events. So this is clearly something that I think it's our responsibility as providers, either on the mental health or the medical side, to make sure that our families are aware that this is an area of active investigation for in our adolescent population. Final thoughts now is that doing nothing just because we don't have enough information is really not a neutral option. So this really, I think the complexities really underscore the importance of a team approach. This is just a quick slide, which is an overview of the program that Diane and I had an opportunity to co-found with other colleagues. It's a university community collaborative where we work together as mental health professionals, medical professionals, and also advocacy professionals who are involved in school training, and also legal professionals and other forms of advocacy. But there are still obviously many areas of uncertainty, challenges, and barriers to care. As I mentioned at the beginning, all of these medications are off-label, expensive, often denied by insurance companies. There's limited access to care, likely reflecting in part prejudice and misunderstanding by our very own colleagues. Again, limited safety and efficacy data, and there is the need for prospective long-term outcome studies, such as the study that I showed you, which is our Foresight study that we abbreviate as Transgender Youth Care, TYC-US. A number of additional areas of uncertainty for blockers. How do we balance gender dysphoria and the ability to provide informed assent in early puberty? Further study needs to be done for fertility preservation. What is the optimal age for initiating gender-affirming hormone treatment, and are the potential adverse effects of blockers on bone and brain mitigated with earlier treatment? What's the age for optimal gender-affirming surgeries? What about non-binary adolescents? We're seeing more and more people appear in our programs, and I'm sure if you're seeing such patients as well, or having gender clinics, you're seeing these individuals as well. And the question is how to safely enable them to achieve their gender-related embodiment goals, for example, while preserving skeletal health. Retransition, what is the true prevalence? The reported prevalence is low. For those that do undergo retransition, did they stop treatment because they reached their goals? Or was there regret, or were there other reasons? And how thoroughly, for those that retransition, were they assessed in the first place per current clinical practice guidelines? In other words, were they evaluated by a qualified mental health gender specialist before even beginning medical intervention? And then lastly, we have the very challenging situation that is evolving right now, which is that there is legislation banning access to gender-affirming medical care for those under 18 in 22 states in the US, 12 currently involved in lawsuits. These lawsuits, in some cases, criminalize providers who follow current evidence-based clinical practice guidelines and standards of care. This has resulted in a significant influx of families requesting care from states where such care is banned. So just to summarize, transgender gender diversity is not rare, is no longer considered pathological, and represents an example of human diversity. Scientific evidence supports biological underpinnings to gender identity development. Gender affirming treatment is optimally provided in an interdisciplinary model of care and has clear mental health, even life-saving benefits, and long-term safety and efficacy studies are necessary to optimize care for transgender and gender diverse youth. Obviously, this requires incredible teamwork, for which I'm so grateful to be part of, and I thank you very much for your attention.
And I believe the baton is now passed to me. And you will see that sometimes Dr. Rosenthal and I are so merged that some of our slides will repeat each other. So bear with me on that. And I'm going to put up my slides. And I'm going to now switch our focus to the mental health provider and what we do in partnership with our medical providers. I have no disclosures, conflict of interest to report. And I wanted to start, and you could see just from the data just presented to you, that we're in a moment in history where when it comes to gender, the earth is moving under our feet. Most of us grew up in Western culture, in the social context. Gender's bedrock, determined typically the day you're born when somebody looks between your legs. And now we have the end of 2023 where gender has become moving boulders, and we don't have gender just in two boxes. We're talking about kind of infinite iterations of gender. And so it's no longer bedrock as we once assumed it to be. And this is a repeat of a slide just to again make the point. There has been an explosion in referrals to pediatric gender clinics. And I don't think it's something in the drinking water, but I do think there's been an incredible paradigm shift in how we understand gender and how people feel comfortable exploring their own gender. And I will say that this makes all of us very nervous. So what we'll be exploring today in this half of the webinar is how do we as mental health professionals apply the gender affirmative model of care in our practice. So we have to start with what you may have learned in school. And this is certainly what I learned in school beginning in the 1960s. I learned that an infant is designated as sex at birth, and it's either male or female. And if it's anything else that's ambiguous, it should get fixed right away, and at least before 24 months, before one sense of I am male, I am female gets fixed. So within the first 2 years of life, after being designated male or female at birth or getting it fixed, the child learns their core gender identity based on that designation. And I underscore core and underline it because it was believed to be an essential and central part that will not change. I am girl, I am boy. That's what the infant to toddler learns. Then from ages 2 to 6, you learn how to do it. You learn what was originally called sex role socialization, what it means to be a boy or girl, and how you live it day to day, and what your appropriate gender roles are. And then for someone like myself, who was trained psychoanalytically, you also learn something else very important that happens between ages 2 and 6. You learn that a child is going to fall in love with their opposite sex parent. And that's with the assumption that all children have 2 opposite sex parents. And once that happens, the love affair, you discover, whoa, that's really dangerous, this fantasized love affair. I better just push that one aside, repudiate it, and instead identify with my like sex parent and wait till I grow up to get my own romantic partner. So in this progression, if all goes well, by age 6, a child's going to be clear in their core gender identity. They are going to accept that status as permanent. No backsies, no trades with the other gender. And they're going to solidify a hetero versus homosexual orientation with erotic desire for the opposite sex and identification with like-sex people, starting with their own parents. If you didn't get there and reach that milestone of gender development by age 6, there's a cause for concern. And that child who didn't get there, along with their parents, should be referred for psychiatric help to analyze the source of this failure in development, which is typically the parents' foibles, and to set the course straight, no pun intended. Now, what does that mean? Yoda tells us, you must unlearn what you have learned. And I have been spending the last decades working on that. So here's the unlearning and the new learning, and what we know today, and know that we're still in the process of learning. One, we've discovered both scientifically, anthropologically, socially, and psychologically that there aren't just 2 boxes, male, female. It turns out there's infinite gender possibilities. Number 2, as outlined by Dr. Rosenthal's, sex, designated at birth, gender identity, gender expressions, sexual identity, orientation, they are separate, but they certainly can be intertwining entities. So gender identity we can think of as the being of gender, and gender expressions as the doing of gender. And so every child is going to use their psyche to establish their own gender self based on nature, nurture, and culture. So what we have is, we now have learned about biological underpinnings, but constitution isn't the only thing. So neither constitution nor environment prevails. They're both living in dialectical tension with each other for each child as they develop their gender. So the gender self will encompass both a core gender identity, different than how I learned about it, but just a basic sense of self, and chosen gender expressions. So we can think of it like this. For every child born, neuroscience is going to interface with genetics. Genetics are going to interface with the intrauterine environment. Physiology and the organism are going to interface with environmental provisions. And the sociocultural political landscape will both wrap around and is also going to be pushed in new directions by all the aforementioned forces. And this is what I call, something I made up, the gender web. And I will now explain that. First, let me say that I was looking at earlier, quite a while ago, the notion of a gender spectrum. And I thought, that's great. It gives you a lot of different colors and hues and gender, but it's very two-dimensional, with male on one side and female on the other. So I was looking out the window and I saw a spider web, and I thought, could we use that for gender? And could we think about a 3-dimensional gender web? So here's a web. Imagine a 3-dimensional stretching in a tree. And what it is each person has a unique gender web, and each person is going to weave together nature, nurture, and culture to make their own unique gender self. Now, we could say, okay, end of story, but let's break down the threads, and it's complicated. And these are the threads that we need to attend to for every child who walks through the door of our office. We have chromosomes, we have hormones, we have hormone receptors, we have gonads, we have primary sex characteristics, we have secondary sex characteristics, we have the brain, we have the mind, we have the intrauterine environment, and then we have socialization. We have our family, school, religious institutions, community, and then we have the culture, the values, the ethics, the laws, the theories, and practices. But we don't stop there. Now we go into the twilight zone. There's actually a 4th dimension. and it's a very important one, and it is time. So every individual is going to alter their gender web as they weave together nature, nurture, and culture over time. It does not stop at age 6. It's a lifetime unfolding. So if we think of the gender web in comparison to fingerprints, we have the following. It's just like fingerprints. All the people on this webinar have unique fingerprints. Not one of ours is the same as the person next to us. But the fingerprints you have are the ones you were born with and the ones you will die with. But a person's gender web, unlike fingerprints, is not going to be immutable. It can and it will change over the course of lifetime, whether it be around identity or expressions. So how do adults fit into a child's gender web as they're spinning it? We need to think of the gender web as every child's personal creation. And if the adults in the child's life grab the threads from the child, they're going to mess up that child's gender web, and they're going to leave this child feeling all tangled up and confused and captured in a false gender self, which we will get to in a little while. If the adults facilitate the child weaving their own personal gender web with adult facilitation and support, that child is going to then feel supported and expansive, and they're going to construct a true gender self. Now, this is some data that I thought speaks so poignantly to the importance of parental support. There are many, many studies. They all come out the same, that if parents offer support, and that equals acceptance for their gender exploring, gender diverse trans youth, the children do better in their mental health. So this was a study done, it was just 84 youth. It was done in Canada. And if you look at the bar graph, the darker blue were the teens who had parents who were supportive. The lighter blue were the teens who had parents who were not supportive. And in every category, satisfaction with life, physical health, mental health, self-esteem, thoughts about parenting in the future, adequate housing, adequate food, the youth were doing a lot better, significantly better, if they had supportive parents. If we look at mental health challenges, and if we look at depression, if we look at suicidality or suicide attempts, there is a remarkable difference, whether there's parental acceptance or not. And the most compelling is suicide attempts, which we would like them to be 0, but they were actually down to 4% for the supported kids and 57% for the kids who were not supported. This is the same data, just presented in a different way. And again, you can see the attempted suicide, 4% if you got support, up to 57% no support. So Dr. Rosenthal already talked about the gender affirmative practice. And now I want to just dive again into the model for mental health purposes in terms of how we do our clinical work. So here are the basic premises for anybody, whatever discipline you are. Gender variations, they're not disorders. There's infinite pathways. Cisgender is only one of many of those pathways. We should consider every pathway positive and no pathway privileged over another. Number 2, gender presentations are diverse and they're varied across cultures, so it requires cultural sensitivity. Number 3, we've already said, and we'll say it again, that gender involves an interweaving of biology, development and socialization, culture, and context. Number 4, gender may be fluid, may not be boxed and with a clear boundary around it, may be non-binary. Number 5, which is very important, if there are co-occurring psychological issues, they're most commonly related to interpersonal and cultural reactions to a person, not to internal pathology. And that leads us to number 6. therefore, pathology more likely lies in the culture rather than in the individual. And ergo, we might consider gender the cure rather than the disease. Now, I want to alert you all to a new diagnosis. Dr. Rosenthal spoke about gender dysphoria and how it's presently used. But there's another diagnosis that we need to pay attention to, and we particularly need to pay attention to it for all of our colleagues who are in states who have either already banned or are threatening to ban pediatric gender care, as we support everybody in doing the best work they can do and doing no harm and doing good for the kids. So social gender dysphoria, defined as this: the stress or distress experienced by a culture or individual within the culture when everything they learned about gender in 2 boxes is incongruent with what youth and adults today are demonstrating about their gender being infinite rather than binary in nature. So if we're going to be thinking about healing the culture, we have to step out of our offices and recognize that the target of treatment may be the social environment, not the child. And we should each scrutinize within ourselves to determine whether we individually are suffering from social gender dysphoria, and then treat that accordingly. And so we need to step out of our office, attend to the gender ills of the social environment as we see them, so that gender diverse children can grow well. And I want to give you a glaring example recently of what I diagnosed as social gender dysphoria. November 2023, there was an attempt by a Texas school district to put a stop to a high school production of Oklahoma, which was already ready to go. All the sets had been done, they got torn down. And the reason, because a trans boy was cast in the lead male role. And the decision, which was then unanimously overruled by the school board, was that the school would only cast students born as females in female roles and students born as males in male roles. And if we extend that thinking, that means there never would have been a Shakespearean play in his time, because only men were allowed to play on stage in the theater. So what we have, what in diagnosis was extreme social gender dysphoria. And what I will say in terms of the cure was protests by students, parents, local community, and the local theater program, the local college's theater program. So curing social gender dysphoria, we want to protect children from it, look in ourselves, see if we're suffering from it, work to correct it. Now, there is a question related often to social gender dysphoria, which is, now how can a young child know their gender? And that's an important question because it's related to both social transitions and to gender affirming medical treatment for youth. Because if they can't know, how can we talk about them changing their gender or receiving medications that may have some irreversible effects? So I'm just going to focus on social transitions here. And we're talking about a switch in gender from the gender others know the child to be to the gender the child knows themselves to be. And it can include a name change, a pronoun change, a legal gender marker change, expressing oneself with clothing and presentation associated with the child's asserted gender. It can be taking on the role of that gender, no medical interventions involved. This is back to our Foresight Trans Youth Care Study with Dr. Rosenthal already presented. And this is what we learned about social transitions. Questions asked to the group that was just going to be starting puberty blockers. How many of them had already socially transitioned before starting puberty and before receiving puberty blockers? The answer, which we did not expect, surprising majority, 89% had already socially transitioned either completely or partially, which typically meant only in certain situations, before reaching puberty. So what did the data tell us? that the theories we learned in school about gender identity being fixed by age 6, they don't seem to be supported by empirical evidence, and that transgender children, just like cisgender children, have the capacity to establish a stable gender identity at an early age, by age 6. And here are photographs of some early social transitioners well before puberty. So what are we supposed to do as mental health professionals? Best clinical practices. The essential therapeutic tenet when we're doing clinical care, not for us to say, the children to tell. We've already seen the cartoon. Is it a boy or a girl? I don't know. It can't talk yet. And as a mental health provider, we haven't heard yet. So the therapeutic task, getting the use gender in focus. The goals. You want to facilitate child's authentic gender self. You want to alleviate gender stress or distress. You want to build gender resilience. And you want to secure social supports for the child. And you want to, very importantly, support the caring environment so the caring environment can support the child. Underlying assumption, we already heard. Every person entitled to live in the gender most authentic to them, a gender that does not necessarily match the sex designated at birth or the culture's social definitions or expectations of gender expressions. And we call this gender health, opportunity to live in one's authentic gender, free from aspersion, surrounded by acceptance. Challenge for those of us who are therapists. We have to be an eye, an ear, and a mirror for every child who walks in our door. And we have to figure out how to translate what the kids are trying to tell us, because they don't always give us a very clear narrative in words. So here we are as an eye, an ear, and a mirror. Process always the same. We get a child's authentic gender in focus by doing that deep dive with the child and would provide all the nutrients for that child or youth gender and overall well-being to thrive. And so we have get in focus nutrients. So here's the challenge, finding the children in translation. We say, if you listen, they'll tell you who they are. But how do we figure out what they're trying to tell us? Translation is possible when we pay attention not to what they say, but what they do or don't do. We learn to suspend ourselves in a state of not knowing and stay there. It's very hard to stay in a state of not knowing gender. We typically like to locate it even before a baby's born. So we really have to stretch to say we don't know yet. And we have to not be in a hurry. Take the time, but sometimes we have to move fast because we may have a child who's in high distress and needs some not only help, but a gender health plan now. We also have to clear our ears of our own gender wax, the biases and countertransferences that we may hold when we hear a child say, I'm not a girl, I'm not a boy, I'm something in the middle, or I'm a gender blender, put everything in the blender, mix it up, that's me. And we have to do that so we can hear what the youth are telling us rather than what we want them to say. Our translation tools, listening, mirroring, play, interpretation, suspension in a state of not knowing, monitoring personal experiences that may distort our gender vision, cultural sensitivity, and collaborative work with parents, family, and community, and I will add other professionals. So now what about this? Yeah, but what if it is gender and something else? Then what do we do? Well, it might be that there is gender as a solution to another life problem. That can happen. It might be that there is gender presenting that's actually a symptom of another underlying disorder, such as some form of schizophrenia, as an example. It can happen. It could be gender as a signal of something outside the child, of disordered parenting or disordered socialization. It can happen. It could be gender for somebody who's been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum disorder as an obsessive phase of their autistic functioning. It might happen. And it could be just gender is running alongside another completely separate psychological issue. And we've already talked about the psychological issues as an outcome of gender minority stress. So I'm not including that right here, But I would say, no, any of these above, and there could be others, they're possible, but I would say they're very rare. So simply think rule out when you are working with a child. Now, I have found in my work that Winnicott has always been a helpmate to me in guiding my work, but really is helpful around getting a child's gender in focus. And it's helpful in a notion of a true self, a false self, and individual creativity. Just to review, in Winnicott's terms, the true self is the authentic core of an individual. The false self layers over the true self, set up to protect oneself, conform to environmental expectations, and individual creativity impulses inside an individual that act to construct the uniqueness of that individual. Now, adapted to gender, look what we have. The true gender self, authentic internal gender identity and expressions, one's own. The false gender self, the presentation we develop, the gender presentation, to protect the true gender self from harm or comply with social environment's expectations or rules or guidelines about gender. Gender creativity, I want to underline, that's where you weave together a unique and authentic gender self based on core feelings and chosen gender expressions. Mirroring, as I've mentioned before, as one of the translation tools, is incredibly important here. And I'm going to turn back to Winnicott. According to Winnicott, mirror is the mother looking at the baby, and what she looks like is related to what she sees there in the baby. And so if you take that for gender mirroring, we as mental health providers should be gender mirrors. The child will depend on us and parents too to mirror back their authentic gender. And it's a relational phenomenon. It depends on two people in interaction with each other. So if gender mirroring gets distorted and I mirror back to a child who they're not around their gender, they're going to experience themselves as misgender. They're going to experience an assault on their true gender self and a barrier to their gender creativity, and perhaps a scramble to embrace a false gender self. So the role of the mental health professional is many things. And I will say that we do have to sometimes make recommendations about gender affirming medical interventions, puberty blockers, hormone surgeries that you just heard about from Dr. Rosenthal. We often have to write a letter of support or report, do a gender health evaluation. Very few areas where mental health professionals asked to weigh in on pediatric medical procedures. It involves significant amount of advanced training, and that part of this work absolutely draws heat from critics, and is why, for some, that should be banned completely. The work can be very anxiety-provoking, and particularly when we're talking about, we have to talk to kids about fertility. We learned that there may be impact on children's future fertility, and it's an ethical obligation to talk to the kids about this before they consent to treatment. But these kids are maybe 9 or 10, 11 years old. They're really quite young to grasp the intricacies of fertility. And in our culture, they're at an age where the main thrust in our culture is don't even think about making babies. So it's a developmental disruption. And we have to really learn how to sensitively communicate information about fertility and fertility preservation, and how to ask kids to start thinking in concrete ways about their future family building options. So that's an added training demand if you're going to be doing this work is learning how to do that in developmentally appropriate terms without too much information. Process still the same, whatever. Get a child's gender in focus, provide the nutrients. Focus, nutrients. Okay, if you decide you want to be a pediatric mental health gender specialist, what do you need? This is according to the WPATH Standards of Care version 8, which recently came out. You need training expertise in child gender development, gender diversity. You need training expertise in general child family mental health across the spectrum, developmental spectrum. You need training and expertise in autism spectrum disorder and neurodiversity. The reason being is there's a high crossover between, and I'll use gender spectrum right now, and autism spectrum, which I call the double helix, rainbow kids. You need continuing education because we're learning as we go related to gender diverse children and families. You need to develop the ability to conduct a comprehensive gender health assessment. Laundry list of challenges. I'll just put these on the screen, but I'm not going to go through them because you will have them in the slides and I'm paying attention to time. But there's a laundry list when you're treating children, and look at this laundry list. There's a laundry list of clinical challenges when you're treating adolescents around gender issues. Now, you never want to go it alone. Gender care is an interdisciplinary endeavor, and the best of all possible worlds, you're going to have medical health professionals, mental health professionals, educational professionals, and legal professionals all coming together to map out one plan for one child, recognizing the uniqueness of every child's gender web in the context of every child's family and social environment. Therefore, we all have to learn to play nicely. And you always keep your eyes on the prize, and that's the child. So I'm going to finish with a clinical case, and these were the parents who needed to know. This is Mercer. Mercer's parents first contacted me when Mercer was 6. They lived a far distance from my office, but they were willing to travel. And they said to me, if you can solve the riddle of my child's gender identity, it will be well worth it. This is a child designated a male at birth. Parents were perplexed. They wondered whether Mercer could be a transgender girl or a drag queen. Parents note, right before our first visit, this was from the mom, why do I need to know if he's a he, she, both, or neither? It's difficult to guide your child or advocate for your child if you don't know their identity. I can't advocate for girl bathroom use while he is a he, but I don't want to push him into the girl box unless he is really a girl. Is this something you can discern from meeting with the child? As I read this, I thought to myself, can I? Now here's Mercer, age 5 to 6. I'm introducing Mercer. Age 5, Mercer began wearing girls' clothes exclusively, but played exclusively with quote unquote boy toys and had friends of both genders. Regarding gender presentation, any new person meeting Mercer assumed Mercer was a girl. This was still true when Mercer was 6. Parents' requests from the mom, would I see Mercer so I could offer insight into Mercer's gender identity? Our mutual decision, bring Mercer in to help get Mercer in focus with the goal of responding to the parents' concerns about who their child was. From the father, we're both scientists, and they were by profession, and we just like to have answers, scientific ones. Can you give us one? My thought, could I? Here are my visits with Mercer. Mercer wore dresses over pants and curls framing their face. Didn't want to talk about gender at all, except as, why do we have to name our genders? And why are my parents always asking me about gender? I'd rather play. Can I take down the Legos? Mercer wanted Mercer's brother to call Mercer a boy, but Mercer wanted the neighbor children across the street to call Mercer a girl because I'm both. These were Mercer's drawings. This was Mercer drawing a person. That person is Lollipop, and that is the name that Mercer had just given themselves at their summer camp. This was Mercer's self-portrait, which became a little bit more definitive than a lollipop. This was Mercer's play. It was a school bus in the desert, and it really didn't have, as far as I could tell, a whole lot of gender meaning in it. Follow-up meeting with parents. I didn't think I had a good scientific answer to offer these two scientists. I learned Mercer spoke of having both a boy and a girl self, matched by what I had observed in Mercer's play. And spur of the moment, really a spur, I just made something up. I made up a diagnosis. I said, I think you have a gender ambidextrous child. It means it's children not bound by binary gender rules and either their identities or expressions. They refer them to themselves as boy, girls, and they're equally comfortable in both roles. And they grow irritated when pushed to declare themselves one or the other or anything. Parents' response, we love it. It's scientific. And now we have something to tell our friends. Fast forward, here's Mercer in high school. Mercer's now a transgender girl, pronouns she, her, previously on puberty blockers, now on hormones, estrogen. Personality, interest, gender presentation have changed not at all since Mercer's early gender ambidextrous days. This is not a picture for confidentiality reasons of gender, of Mercer. This could be Mercer. to conclude, pediatric gender affirmative care is going to take a village, an individual, a family, friends, community, religious leaders, educators, mental health professionals, medical professionals, attorneys and judges, policy and lawmakers, legislators. And the most important thing is we're still learning from the kids. Question asked to one of our gender clinic 9-year-old patients who recently and socially transitioned, male to female, age 8. What would you do if someone told you that now it was time to go back to living as a boy? Emphatic response, I'd take him to court. And there was a pause. They can take me to court. Lesson to be learned, take good care of our pediatric gender patients and avoid going to court.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you, Dr. Aronsath and Dr. Rosenthal. You packed so much information into a short period of time, and yet it was so clear and digestible. So thank you. There are a lot of questions. We only have time for a couple. So let me throw one first to Dr. Rosenthal, if I might. The person in the audience said, I would love to know your thoughts on what appears to be the increased incidence of kids coming out as transgender in late adolescence or young adulthood. I typically hear parents state that there were no signs at all throughout childhood of any gender dysphoria. So this might be a question for both of you, but Dr. Rosenthal, if you'll start first.
Well, thank you. I think that's really an important question. And I do think that it is something that can be discussed by Dr. Aronsaft as well. There has been a postulated or purported diagnosis called rapid onset gender dysphoria. I didn't mention that. I know Dr. Aronsaft didn't specifically mention that. There's a lot of controversy about that, but that basically is a term that has been offered by a particular researcher to describe exactly what you were summarizing. And in this particular study, this individual had interviewed parents of transgender or gender. They'd interviewed parents, but not the adolescents themselves. And these parents were recruited from websites that were not known to be particularly supportive of gender care. And basically what came out of that was the whole idea that there could be a social contagion, that this isn't really real. It's just that, their friends are feeling this way, and then they start to think about it and feel that it applies to them as well. But the very fact that it didn't include the adolescents themselves led to the initial article actually being modified to acknowledge these problems. And we know that and this sort of reflects on something that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about prevalence. When you're talking about the prevalence of a situation, limitations that would apply to those as well as to this type of specific question that you're asking, or that you're restating, Jana, is that what is the person's degree of self-awareness, or even more, what is that person's willingness to disclose that to someone? So you may have someone that has that information, but they haven't disclosed it to the parents yet because they haven't felt comfortable doing that. So one could mistake the observation that because the parents don't know, meaning that this isn't existing, and it may simply be that the person hasn't come out, rather than the fact that it's like a de novo situation.
Right. Dr. Aronsaft, you want to comment on that as well?
I'm just going to piggyback on it. Given what Dr. Rosenthal just said, and it is sometimes up to 8 years that a child is known before they communicate either to their parents or to somebody else. Often their parents are the last to know, which is really hard for parents. And it often comes in a text from the next room. And but what I would say is what we should therefore think about is rapid onset parental discovery. That is what really need, and the parents really need support in that. I would say something else. If the gender web is a lifelong process of unfolding, and if Erik Erikson was right, that adolescence is a time of identity exploration, confusion, and confirmation, Sometimes it takes to the end of adolescence for that to come together. So if you throw gender in the hopper, it's really makes sense as in terms of the timeliness, why later, because they're poetry in motion until then. And so we have to consider that as well. And also we have to consider historical context. Things have changed. And in the end of 2023, there's social media, there's a new paradigm of gender. So kids can find a mirror and find a place to say, that's me. And 10 years ago, that mirror was maybe not as prevalent as it is now, even with the pushback against it.
Mhm. Great explanation by both of you. Thank you very, very much. And unfortunately, that we only had time for that one question. And trust me, there are a lot. But I think what you've done is you've stimulated curiosity, but also provided very valuable information. So I want to thank you both. I would imagine that everyone was inspired by your work, even if they didn't agree with it or didn't understand it fully. But your words, your dedication, and your action is well noted.